looking at the two principles of justice of John Rawls, the principles having the second principle having two components. Let us have a look at the method which Rawls deploys in his argument. In fact, as I have mentioned earlier also, that his method can be seen as a method of comparative analysis, because he presents his theory side by side alongside other theories of justice, particularly utilitarianism, perfectionism and Marxism, and then perhaps offers his argument and says that his argument is more rational and fair. Therefore, people in original position are driven by rationality will choose justice as fairness, which is Rawls's theory of justice. Now, of course, apart from this comparative aspect, there is also one hypothetical contract in Rawls, like any contract theorist. So, falling in this contractualist tradition, as I mentioned earlier also, in fact, Rawls also argues through a hypothetical contract. In fact, the contract theorists like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, in their thought we find a state of nature as a state which was there before formally the state emerged. But in Rawls, that stage is, or that status is, or that state is called original position. So therefore, instead of calling it state of nature, unlike Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, Rawls calls it original position. Now, of course, as I have mentioned, that there is a lot of Hobbesian rationalism and self-interest in his argument, particularly as I just now mentioned that how Rawls believes that doing anything for the least advantage is not from the standpoint of least advantage. It is not because your heart is bleeding for them, but it is from the self-interest standpoint, that people are doing it in their own interest, particularly as averse to risk. As a conservative risk taker, human beings know that tomorrow someone else is in that position of disadvantage, tomorrow he or she may also be in the similar situation. So therefore, they want to secure that position by choosing a principle of justice where there is a scope or space for helping or basically for supporting the least advantage. So therefore, you can see both the Hobbesian rationalism and the self-interest coming in in Rawls. Then there is another aspect in his method which is quite well talked about, and that is reflective equilibrium. What is this reflective equilibrium? This reflective element of mind brings rationality and balance in their behavior. So therefore, through this component, what Rawls argues, that it is not coming from outside, that the kind of balance which human beings demonstrate, particularly in original position when they are under spell of rationality, that is not coming from outside, but this is already inside them. And therefore, what happens, that principles which they choose are reflection of their moral judgment. Though regions may be different, but all of them will be able to rationalize it. So therefore, this is what he means by a reflective equilibrium. Then of course, there are many assumptions in Rawls, and those assumptions are important, or one can say the premises on which he builds his theory of justice. Of course, the first one is this contractual assumptions, or falling in line with this contractual tradition. In fact, the way the contract theorists have argued that there was a state of nature before formal state was created. In fact, Rawls argues that there is original position where people gather to have a theory of justice. And in fact, this was not happening in the proper society where you are basically have all informations and all knowledge about each other, but it was a kind of position or a situation where people are basically in the society but also outside society. So basically, literally, they are basically ignorant about their identity, about their possession, about their talent and other attributes. Of course, they may be knowing immense, but literally they know nothing. So they are wise but uninformed. So therefore, this is something what Rawls assumes in original position in order to arrive at his argument. Now then, of course, another important innovation he does in his theory is this veil of ignorance. And this, what is this veil of ignorance? In fact, veil of ignorance in Rawls is that when people gathered to have a theory of justice, what happened, that they were ignorant about each other, about their position, about their talent, about their identities, whether they are male or a female or belonging to this faith or that faith, what was their other attributes, but they were wise. Wise in the sense that they had reason and rationalism and rationality to choose what was in their interest. So therefore, one can say that under veil of ignorance there was general wisdom, but there was particular ignorance. They were wise but ignorant. So therefore, this was the purpose of this inserting veil of ignorance, because these are the assumptions, and he is doing all these in order to build his argument for theory of justice. One thing is to be remembered, that all are hypothetical. In fact, he is making these hypotheses in order to build an argument and arrive at a theory of justice, which he argues is quite fair and just. Now, the other, in fact, this assumption of veil of ignorance, as I have mentioned, that they are ignorant about their identity, talent, power, etc., but they are also averse to risk. So therefore, under veil of ignorance, they were going to take a safer position, which may be useful for them in future, that will be in their interest. And therefore, I told you, that's why I mentioned earlier that this talking about the least advantage is not from the standpoint of least advantage, but from the standpoint of self-interest. Now therefore, what we find, that there is a logical necessity for having these premises, assumptions, hypothetical arguments in order to make in order to evolve a consensus on principle of justice, particularly as fair. In order to create this consensus, it is important that people are insulated from their biases, from preferences, and and a kind of neutrality is created, so that a consensus on principles of justice could emerge. In fact, one can find here that this argument is quite akin to Rousseau's quest for common good. The way Rousseau was trying to create a true community, or find out a basis for a common good through his general will, we can also see that similar argument happening in Rawls. Now, one thing to be remembered, that a lot of scholars have pointed out that this entire veil of ignorance, which Rawls innovated and brought in his argument, in his theory, was basically guided by or influenced by what happened in the Constitutional Convention in the USA in 1787, when the Constitution was being drafted after aftermath of revolution. In fact, what happened, that the members of the Constitutional Convention in the USA, who were working without this so-called veil of ignorance of Rawls, what happened, that they legitimized slavery, they legitimized property ownership, and they attached, tagged slavery with property ownership, and there was a lot of property class in that convention. So therefore, the members of the Constitutional Convention, even after they met after revolution to create a liberal order, just liberal order, in fact, the members acted in a partisan manner. So therefore, Rawls, perhaps it was in the back of Rawls's mind, and so therefore he is trying to rectify the kind of error which the Constitutional Convention made and the members committed. So therefore, he is innovating veil of ignorance through this in his original position, to basically insulate people from biases and self-interested, or one can say that create a space of neutrality. In fact, it is meant to rectify the error of Constitutional Convention of 1787 in United States of America. So therefore, in fact, that is one thing to be remembered. Another thing, in fact, is this example of cake cutting, which Rawls also gives in his book. What is this cake cutting? All of us must have experienced this cake cutting. When cake is cut, in fact, it is cut with two assumptions or it is based on two premises. The first is that cake, every piece of slice of cake is equally distributed, because equality is good. And the second is that the person with the knife will have the last slice, and therefore, it will be the bigger slice also. So therefore, self-interested nature of human being is also premised in this, along with equality. That the person with the knife who is cutting the cake will take the cake at the end, and therefore will have the bigger slice of cake, because the self-interested nature of human being is not to be overcome even if someone has a knife or basically acting as a kind of distributor. So therefore this cake cutting is a kind of example to illustrate the thing that equality is good, but at the same time the self-interested nature of human behavior, character will not allow that thing to happen, and therefore perhaps this innovation of veil of ignorance in original position in order to create a position of neutrality. So therefore in fact one can say that through veil of ignorance original position becomes a position of neutrality in Rawls, resulting in three principles of justice. First is liberty, which we have seen that one should have the most extensive liberty compatible with the similar liberty for all, and number two is equality of opportunity and not outcome, and the third is the positive discrimination, that is inequality should be arranged in order to help the least advantaged. So therefore what happens that the liberty, equality and difference principles emerge out of this original position where people are acting under veil of ignorance. So this is how Rawls believes that this theory that is justice as fairness is rational, just and fair, and people are choosing it not because of any other reason, but it is in their interest, and because they are a rational creature, therefore they believe they have to go for this instead of utilitarianism, perfectionism, Marxism, of any other theory. So therefore this is what you can see happening in Rawls. Now the assumptions, as I mentioned earlier, also lexical priority, that how he brings liberty before equality and brings equality before difference. Now as a true liberal, Rawls privileges liberty, and there is nothing surprising in it. So far we have seen that how many liberal elements are coming out through his theory. So therefore let's there be no confusion on this, that essentially he is a liberal thinker, interested, or one can say concerned with the well-being of liberal order, liberal society. He wants a procedural fairness and a procedural justice where some elements of substantive justice are also brought in order to make liberal order more human and more livable. So therefore as a true liberal he privileges liberty and then procedural fairness and also individual rights and liberty, unlike utilitarians who emphasize collective happiness, or one can say greatest happiness of greatest number. Rawls believes in individual rights and liberty. And when he talked of liberty, basically his liberty was more or less the Bill of Rights in the United States of America or many other constitutions, where they come as fundamental rights, liberty of thought, expression, civil and political rights. So therefore this is what he meant by liberty. Now of course in Rawls the entire argument is meant to make inequality look fair, as the rich will contribute to mitigate the hardship and the disadvantage of the least advantage. So therefore this is what Rawls believes, that how the liberal society should undertake such initiative. And as we know, the taxation and other things through the state, where the rich is taxed to help the poor, is essentially meant to do this, that how inequality will look fair, that even if it is unequal distribution, the rich is being taxed, and that taxation, the taxed money is going only for those who are not paying tax. But nonetheless, this entire idea is to make equality look more fair. So therefore this is what perhaps you can see in Rawls. Now of course this assumption in Rawls is also in terms of the distribution of basic structure. As I mentioned earlier, that justice is essentially meant for distribution of resources and other values. Of course as a resource egalitarian, Rawls is more concerned with distribution of resources. Then perhaps self-respect and other things which social egalitarians these days emphasize. Of course he mentioned this self-respect, but he doesn't take this argument any further. So therefore we can say that as a resource egalitarian, Rawls is interested in distribution of resources, and particularly he is saying that the distribution of basic structure. And what is this basic structure in Rawls? The basic structure in Rawls is that there are social goods. goods like liberty, opportunity, income and wealth, self-respect. As I mentioned that he does not say much about self-respect, but it is somewhat Kantian influence on him, because Kant, the way he looked at dignity and self-respect as essential dimension and aspect of human life. Now, the second aspect of this basic structure, the first is the social goods, second is the primary natural goods, and the under primary natural goods come health, vigor and intelligence. So, therefore, this basic structure is to be distributed by selecting these principles of justice in original position according to Rawls. Now, of course, after looking at Rawls's assumptions, his premises, his principles of justice and what type of innovations he makes, and the context in which he is building his argument, and the background, in the backdrop of what had happened in United States of America in aftermath of revolution and the 1787 constitutional conventions, that how the self-interested members of the convention were guided by their own interest, and therefore slavery and other things were legitimized, and how Rawls is trying to overcome and rectify this through his conceptual innovations like veil of ignorance and reflective equilibrium and so on and so forth. Now, we come to the second part, that is criticism. That after the publication of this book, Theory of Justice 1971, Rawls has been subjected to most scathing criticism by scholars, both belonging to liberal and the Marxist tradition. Even the liberals have not spared Rawls, in spite of the fact that Rawls, in spite of talking in a language of egalitarianism, is very much part of this liberal order. In fact, all features and characteristics of liberal thinking are very much present in Rawls, which we have seen. Self-interest, the nature of human behavior, rationalism, choice and many other things. But nonetheless, he has been critiqued by a number of liberal scholars, and some of the critiques of course are communitarians within liberalism, which is a later development. And as we know that this after this rise of communitarianism, multiculturalism and other things, how the liberalism itself, the classical liberalism and its various variants have been criticized for ignoring the social linkages of human self, particularly the way the community identity has been ignored by liberalism. In the way liberalism looked at individuals as unencumbered self, as abstract individual, that has been the target of the communitarians so far as the liberalism is concerned. And Rawls, they also believe that basically belong to the same tradition, who has ignored altogether community linkages of human identity. And under veil of ignorance, Rawls, according to communitarians, erroneously believe that human beings can overcome their identity, because for communitarians these identities can never be overcome. Now, this is what the communitarians argue. I will just mention these communitarians, particularly some of the communitarians who are perhaps prominent critique of Rawls. But before coming to the communitarians, I should like to mention a libertarian thinker like Robert Nozick. But one thing I should mention here before I discuss Nozick, that the second book which Rawls wrote, and I mentioned earlier also, Political Liberalism in 1993, in fact he responded to great extent some of the criticisms which were directed towards his theory of justice, and particularly the critiques which came from communitarian point of view. And therefore, in that light one can also see that Rawls modifying his position and climbing down from his high a moral pedestal where he was standing earlier. So therefore, one can find a modified position of Rawls in his second book, that is Political Liberalism, and particularly in light of the criticism coming from communitarians. Now, coming to the libertarian thinker, scholar like Robert Nozick, in fact who was his colleague in Harvard University in USA, and particularly the book which he wrote, Anarchy, State and Utopia, which many people believe was a response to Rawls's theory of justice published in 1971. In fact, in this book and other writings, Nozick offers a critique of egalitarianism and also argues for a minimalist state. In fact, Rawls's minimax principle, that how maximize the advantage the argument which Rawls offers, in fact, according to Nozick, is not liberal theory of justice. In fact, according to Nozick, Rawls allows degeneration of liberty for the least advantaged, which is basically inimical for liberal order. In fact, Nozick is a believer in entitlement theory of property based on inviolability of property rights, just acquisition and just transfer and rectification principles. So, therefore, in fact, Nozick believes that whatever Rawls has argued in his theory of justice is thoroughly unacceptable. In fact, there are also Marxist scholars who have criticized Rawls. If the libertarians have critiqued Rawls for degenerating liberty, while emphasizing equality, particularly through his argument of difference principle or the least advantage in the interest of least advantage, the Marxists have attacked in fact Rawls for prioritizing liberty over equality and not giving it adequate space in his theory. Cohen, as a Marxist scholar, who has critiqued Rawls from the Marxist perspective, he believes that Rawls's basic structure conceals exploitation. In fact, the entire discourse of Rawls is structured in a manner where it is intentionally done to conceal the exploitation in the capitalist society, in the liberal social order, and therefore Rawls is basically doing that job as a liberal thinker. Now, there are other criticisms, and some of the criticisms have come from the feminist scholars, and one such a scholar is Susan Okin. In fact, Susan Okin believes that Rawls attaches women to family and their husband, and therefore does not treat them as autonomous agent or does not give them the subjecthood which they deserve. In fact, this phrase of the feminism, personal is political, according to Susan Okin, Rawls ignores, and therefore, in fact, he does not bring in the issues concerning distribution within family, which is a personal domain, in his entire framework, and therefore, in fact, this is a fallacious argument. Even the gender neutrality which he proposes, particularly through his veil of ignorance, is also fallacious according to the feminist scholars. Next come communitarians, and perhaps that was the major attack on Rawls. The communitarians, in fact, who have been working broadly within the liberal order, and they have been critiquing liberalism from inside and trying to rectify some of the errors and mistakes which the liberal society has committed over the ages, and they want liberalism to embrace the communitarian principles in order to make the liberal world more tangible, more livable, and also more humane. In fact, one such communitarian scholar is Michael Sandel, particularly in his book Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. In fact, Sandel argues that persons are not abstract entities making choices. In fact, they are located and grounded in community. In fact, the argument of liberalism that human beings are unencumbered self is totally untrue. In fact, the role of community in constituting person, in fact, is to be recognized. In fact, human self is an embedded self. Men can never be behind veil of ignorance because they cannot detach themselves from their identity. The communitarian logic would have been better than the individual logic which Rawls posits in his theory. In fact, according to communitarians, the state need not to be neutral. Rather, states should try to promote a notion of various good or different good life. There is not one notion of good life, or there is no one notion of good in society. There are multiple notions. Every community may have their own notion of good life. So, therefore, a state, instead of becoming neutral player, should promote different notions of good life, and people should be allowed to have different spheres through which they can live and lead a good life. So, therefore, this is the communitarian way of looking at an ideal and just society. Now, there is another thinker is Michael Walzer, and his book Sphere of Justice. In fact, he has attacked Rawls particularly for giving a universalist distributive principles. because according to Walger, that there cannot be any universal principle of justice. In fact, justice is ultimately distribution, and distribution is to be decided on the basis of the site of production, because the values which are produced at different sites carry different meanings. The values which are produced in family are different from values which are produced in the marketplace. There cannot be one standard of distribution of values associated with family and associated with market. In family, you cannot bring inequality. You cannot give incentive to a child who is more bright or more energetic. You have to distribute equally food to all your children, whether they are dull or lazy or bright. But in market, different logic prevails. You have to give incentive as per their behavior, as per their entrepreneurship, as per their talent. So therefore, inequality is to be practiced in as a principle of distribution in market, but not in family. So therefore, meaning is attached as per the site of production. But Rawls tries to give a theory of justice based on universalist principles of distribution, which according to Walger is fallacious. So therefore, in fact, one can see that Walger's criticism is also there. Then the next criticism is by Darkin, particularly the book Justice for Hedgehogs, published in 2011. And Darkin, interestingly, on the one hand builds on Rawls's theory of justice, and on the other hand, he tries to fill in some gaps in Rawls. And one is this, the brute luck, because Darkin is called a luck egalitarian. In fact, he was influenced by Rawls' concern for equality, but adds brute luck, an endowment dimension in distribution, and brings in and tries to bring in ambition and insurance in his argument to harmonize both choice and brute luck. So therefore, in fact, this entire argument of insurance in Darkin to neutralize the endowment which people take birth. For example, someone is physically challenged, someone is blind, some has other type of disadvantages at the birth. So therefore, that is the brute luck. And Darkin believes that Rawls ignored this brute luck, which he tries to harmonize with the choice. And therefore, like Rawls, he also talks about original position. He doesn't say original position, but kind of lottery, particularly on an island when a shipwrecked immigrants are caught, and therefore they indulge in choices through lottery and other things. So therefore, through a very intricate analysis, which I had a long discussion about Darkin when I discussed equality. In fact, Darkin tries to fill in the gaps in Rawls by bringing this brute luck as well as the insurance in order to help those who are born with the brute luck, and particularly to compensate or offset the endowment dimension, particularly in society. Now, of course, Joseph Raz recently has tried to synthesize Rawls and Darkin, particularly individual good and the common good. So therefore, these are some of the criticisms on Rawls. In conclusion, we can say that Rawls has responded to critiques, particularly in his book Political Liberalism. Rawls has modified his position. Earlier, he thought that liberalism as a comprehensive doctrine, but now he limits it and believes in multiple value systems in society. Rawls agrees that people may have different comprehensive doctrines in different contexts, not only liberalism, but also argues that still they can agree on overlapping consensus. And this overlapping consensus is the common standard governing life. Now, liberal democratic system as a reference point. Now, overlapping consensus according to Rawls with respect to political life is required for stable governance. In personal sphere, one can continue with their comprehensive doctrine, which the commentarians argue, but still people can agree on common principles for governance. And therefore, Rawls's argument is that they should agree on a theory of justice for governance and for stability. In fact, he limits his theory of justice, particularly in his second book, that is Political Liberalism, to political justice only. He limits it to liberal societies. He says that it may not be valid for non-liberal one. He makes distinction between comprehensive doctrine and political conception of justice based on overlapping consensus. So this is how we can look at Rawls, some of the criticisms and his responses.